Honourable Senators, as this will probably be the final moment to discuss this bill, I wanted to put on record again that the discouraging part of this is that the homework was not done by the government. One can disagree with a policy initiative of a government, but it becomes very serious when the government does not consult in a meaningful way, and the preparation on something as significant as Bill C-45 is done, but most of it will have to be done after the bill passes. One of the interesting points that was brought forward was the report of the Senate called the Report of the Senate Special Committee on Illegal Drugs, which was filed in the Senate in September of 2002. There were 11 recommendations there. There was a questioning of whether our laws, as they presently stood in 2002, were in fact helpful to Canadian society. But what the 11 recommendations did was put out a roadmap, a place to go if you wanted significant change in the society. I want to read out one of the recommendations, Recommendation 11, and it stated, the committee recommends that the Government of Canada instruct the Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Trade to inform the appropriate United Nations authorities that Canada is requesting an amendment to the conventions and treaties governing illegal drugs, and that the development of a drugs and dependency monitoring agency for the Americas be supported by the Government of Canada. Nothing was done to indicate to the UN sources or other international bodies that, in fact, we would be violating 3 of the major conventions, international conventions, not to mention some others. Had we done so, I think we would be in a better place to maintain our foreign policy stature when we question violations by others of conventions in the national interest. So I want to underscore that again, as I believe that to be extremely significant. And while the Committee of Foreign Affairs and International Trade indicated that all would not be lost if the government puts in a concerted plan to address these issues, and that includes the Aboriginal Declaration, that includes the Convention of the Rights of the Child, but more particularly the drug conventions. The government must act if Canada's reputation on the world stage is to be maintained. We often speak about Canada's unique and important position, but I believe we have to do more than talk about it. We have to do something about it. And while it would have been preferable 2 years ago to make the indication, we would have then not been in violation of the conventions. We could have adhered to the conventions according to the processes within the convention. So I wanted to underscore that. I also wanted to pay tribute to those that sat on the committee that Senator Nolan chaired, because they actually did put out a roadmap. They understood how complex this issue is. And I urge the Government of Canada, I urge the Senators, I urge the House of Commons and others to read those 11 recommendations. While you might say some of them are outdated, they are only outdated by new scientific information and by the change in our societies. But the fundamental recommendations are still good. Do not move until you've researched. Do not move until you educate. The report is riddled with appeals for education to put in place, to put in people who will monitor, assess before you start changing the laws. And one other message in the report was that you do it in not a full context and a menu of drug changes. You do it incrementally so that society can adjust to it. And I'm afraid we're not doing that by Bill C-45. The other comment that I want to make is that the most significant impact is not going to be on people my age or adults. The most significant impact is going to be what our Senate Standing Committee on Human Rights said the silent citizens, those who do not have a vote, the children of Canada. It will be them and their children that will be impacted by this law. We have not put in place the kind of education that we need to. We do not have the pieces in place. Perhaps Maclean's, if we're going to use newspapers and that, was right. The federal government announced that it wants to legalize marijuana, but turned over the hard part to the provinces and the municipalities. They also turned it over to the children to have to cope. They're not getting the resources, they're not getting the information. For that matter, I don't believe the public. They're going to awake to what the impact is going to be on society as they live through it. Surely, in this day and age, a transparent and accountable government in a governance model would have put the pieces in place. The legislation should have had the supporting material for implementing, and we are struggling, as we noticed in the committees. We are suggesting, we are appealing of what needs to be done, but really what we're saying is what should be done. We will not suffer the disabilities. It will be the next generations, and I think we are we're doing a disservice to the young people by not having put the pieces in place before we put Bill C-45 in place. So I still believe that we should not move in this direction. I will oppose Bill C-45 because I don't believe it is a good piece of legislation. So I will continue to draw to attention that this bill has its defects simply because we have not thought ahead, and therefore I cannot accept the message from the House. I believe that we still have time if the government properly sits down and consults with the provinces, with the municipalities, but all of the caregivers that are going to have to look after the children, the teachers, the social workers, the judges, your neighbors, to understand the significance of this bill, the significance to the next generations. We should not have silenced the young people. We should have consulted in a more meaningful way. If the government will not delay to allow proper implementation, I fear what the negative consequences will be. So I appeal to the government to stop, to think carefully before we visit difficulties on the next generations. In any piece of law, there are unintended consequences. We should not start out with not understanding the real consequences today, because society will change and their needs will change. That in itself is more than a society can handle. But to start out and say, we'll legalize marijuana and everything will fall in place, it does not work that way if you've worked with children. So I trust that we continue to monitor this situation, to do what we need to do, and to appeal to this government to delay those parts that are not properly in place and that the education has not been put in place. Go back to Senator Nolan's report. They put in 5-year time limits for education. They put in research, and it had time limits. Surely, 2002, we knew less about cannabis. We know so much more, which gives me even more pause to worry about the young people. So my emphasis is there. I trust the government will seriously look at it and not celebrate the day the bill is in place, but rather take its responsibilities seriously. Thank you.
Senator Eggleton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The fact is, colleagues, that the present system does a disservice to young Canadians. The present system is broken. It needs fixing. The fact is, there are extensive number of users of cannabis in this country, particularly between the ages of 18 and 25. It is one of the biggest usage levels anywhere in the world. It spawns a $7 billion illicit industry in this country. So the government, I think, has shown courage in bringing forth a transformational piece of legislation that changes this from one where we criminalize a lot of our young people. We give them criminal records that ruin their lives in many respects, that don't give them the opportunity for the kind of jobs and advancements that they need in our society. The government has brought forward a legislation that shifts this all towards health, safety, regulation of the industry, to make sure of what the product is that our people are going to be, in fact, consuming. And at the same time does provide education. They are well on their way in terms of providing the education now. Oh, we may not recognize a lot of it because a lot of it is geared towards younger people who have a little bit different kinds of access to information than perhaps some of us older folks do. Oh, and yes, they do need to do an awful lot more, and that must go hand in hand right down the line with the implementation of this legislation. There's no doubt about that. I think the government has said, but I think we've said it even louder through all of the studies that we've done, the 5 committees, including the one I have the opportunity to chair, Social Affairs, which has brought together some 200 witnesses in the course of our 2 months of dealing with the study and the other studies that went before. That's a lot of information. And yes, we came up with some ideas that we felt would make this legislation better. Now, the government did accept some of them, but there were some of the major pieces that they did not. And I must say that the part about their answer that disappointed me was that they said, well, we respectfully disagree, that's a common phrase, and they gave the reason as being they felt they had a better answer. That's in effect what they were saying. I think it would have been better for them to have delved into what gave rise to those amendments, because the kind of arguments that we heard at committee, I think, were very compelling and deserved attention. Not just the wording of the amendment itself, but what gave rise to them. And they followed every detail that we were going through in the course of our studies. So I felt that was one thing that could have been done a little bit better. But you know, when it comes down to the basics of moving to a health and safety perspective on this, one of the arguments that impressed me came from Dr. Bernard Lafall, who is the medical head at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, or known as CAMH, and it's one of the preeminent institutions of this country. We've all quoted people from both sides of the argument. I mean, there was no shortage of people contradicting each other or coming up with different facts, you might say, or different statistics or different analytics of the statistics. Oh, there was no shortage of that. One could create a lot of confusion over it. But I think it's quite impressive when an organization, a preeminent organization head, as Dr. Lafall says, we should take an overall public health approach, not a criminal law approach. We can greatly reduce the harms of illicit drugs, including cannabis, by focusing on the underlying public health issues. Most of the harms are caused by the laws we have put into place rather than by the drugs themselves. And this was a point that was reiterated by the Criminal Lawyers Association, who told us, quote, in simple terms, it's the criminalization of marijuana, not marijuana itself, that is responsible for these harms, end of quotes. So I think the basis of this bill is a good one for Canadians. We did get some, I didn't get all of our amendments, but we did get A couple of things I want to note, because they haven't been mentioned yet today. One was the issues that were raised at the Aboriginal Committee. I think we got a pretty firm commitment from the government, and that's a pretty major move. They needed to make that move, and they knew where we stood on the matter in this chamber. And I'm glad they made the move that they did. It's a process at this point. It still requires a lot of good faith in how it proceeds, but at least we have that process in place, and the people in this chamber, many of whom were behind all of that happening, are involved in that continuing process. There's another possible one, too, that comes out of some of the arguments we made about the double jeopardy or the double penalty that could result from somebody who is a permanent resident versus a Canadian citizen, which could lead to their not only getting the penalty under the law, under this cannabis law, but at the same time could also find themselves being disqualified for citizenship or being, in fact, deported. And here we're not, the concern was over people who, simple possession or simple small kind of sentencing that might be provided, or even a fine provided in those cases. Not the big drug dealers, that's a whole different sphere, and that's not the people we were talking about here. But we said for more minor offenses, that double jeopardy shouldn't exist. And the minister said in a letter to a few of us that had a conference call with him last Saturday morning, "I'd like to assure you that I am committed to carefully considering and addressing the immigration consequences of Bill C-45 and C-46. My department is examining the tools within my authority to mitigate immigration consequences, including discretionary tools." And a group of us are going to follow up. So I think there still is opportunities through those two provisions that have come in the course of the back and forth discussions with the federal ministers to still bring about some improvements. But now we're at the stage, it's time to address the message that is before us, and I simply say it's time to accept the message. Thank you.
Senator Patterson.
Thank you, Honourable Senators. I rise today to speak to the message from the other place regarding Bill C-45. As I thought about whether or not I would vote to accept the message or advocate this chamber holding our ground, I not only reflected on everything that I've heard throughout Nunavut and throughout our fulsome study and debate of the bill, but I also reviewed Senator Harder's paper from this past April entitled Complementarity. Is that a word? The Senate's constitutional role. It is a word now. The first point that struck me was Senator Harder's belief that the Senate should adopt a stance of democratic deference to the government's electoral platform when passed into law by the House of Commons, in accordance with the principles underlying the Salisbury Convention, which does not preclude amendments that would improve the legislation. So I reviewed the Liberal platform, and I saw their promise that the Liberal government, quote, with input from experts in public health, substance abuse and law enforcement, will design a new system of strict marijuana sales and distribution with appropriate federal and provincial excise taxes applied. To my mind, this means that the Senate, through debate and proposed amendments, has been attempting to improve the legislation by ensuring that the government not break its campaign promises with this bill. Several amendments passed by this chamber and ultimately rejected by the other place were based exactly on the expert advice received during committee study. The bill also contradicts, as Senator Christmas stated during debate, another campaign promise made by the Trudeau Liberals to do more to make sure that the voices of Indigenous peoples are heard in Ottawa by cutting them out of the excise tax regime and manifestly not properly consulting with them. Senator Harder went on to say that we must strike a balanced approach to amending government legislation with an outlook emphasizing, but not strictly limited to, the areas that are at the heart of the Senate's institutional mission. And colleagues, I do believe that through the study of this bill, we have done just that. Several areas that Senator Harder identified include the interplay of legislation with the Constitution of Canada, including the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and the division of legislative powers between Parliament and the provincial and territorial legislators, and treaties and international agreements that Canada has ratified. The detrimental impact of legislation on minorities and economically disadvantaged groups, the impact of legislation on regions, provinces, and territories, but with a view to the national interest of the Federation as a whole, consultations conducted with stakeholder groups, if at all required by law, and the text of the legislation for drafting errors, serious unintended consequences, or other potential oversights. Well, colleagues, I do believe that the Senate's amendments were crafted to address concerns surrounding each of those areas. We can all agree that Senator Dean's amendments, such as the addition of forgotten commas and corrections to the French version, addressed the drafting errors in this bill. Senator Seidman's proposal to prohibit brand stretching was clearly aimed at addressing what the majority of this chamber believed was a potential oversight in an effort to protect our youth. Senator Petitclerc's amendment sought to clarify the division of federal and provincial or territorial powers. Honourable Senators, laws that are local in nature generally fall into the exclusive jurisdiction of the provinces, and the provinces are granted jurisdiction over property and civil rights. Why can't province...
Sorry for interrupting you. It being 6 o'clock, Honourable Senators has agreed that we not see the clock. Agreed? Senator Patterson.
Thank you. Why can't provinces then decide that the damage of allowing plants to be grown in the home are too detrimental to allow? And why can't they decide that growing marijuana in a dwelling house would impede upon the civil liberties of those in multiplexes who choose not to subject themselves to cannabis? And by the way, it's not only Quebec and Manitoba that are concerned about this issue, but also the government of Nunavut. And the list goes on. Senator Amadvar pushed to protect immigrants who may face disproportionate repercussions for sentences handed down that are less than 6 months. Senator White pushed for an amendment that addressed the concerns of expert witnesses that represent the chiefs of police of this country. Senator Carinion's amendment was aimed at improving the legislation to make sure that we did not unintentionally provide the black market with a backdoor to the new licit trade by requiring that the names of shareholders in licensed facilities be made public. Honourable Senators, we have done our duty. We have a constitutional mandate, as Senator Harder outlined, to work to protect the regional interests, the minority interests. We have a constitutional duty to give voice to those who are underrepresented, youth and immigrants. We have a constitutional duty to ensure that the laws that pass our chamber are free of error, prejudice, and are in accordance with the Charter, the Constitution, and international treaties. We have listened to expert witnesses and thoroughly, thoughtfully, and passionately debated this bill for months. The amendments rejected are based on extensive study and were passed by a majority of this chamber. Every legislative change rejected fits into the areas outlined in Senator Harder's paper. We ping, but we generally ought not to pong, says Senator Harder. But I ask you, colleagues, if we do not stand our ground now, then when is it appropriate? If we do not push hard on a bill that the government itself has termed a piece of transformative public policy, then when should we exercise our constitutional mandate to improve this legislation based on the areas that are at the heart of the Senate's institutional mission? Colleagues, I cannot accept this message. Thank you.
Senator East Belmar. Andy Bill. All right.
Thank you, Chair. Honourable Senators, I rise to speak to the message from the other place in front of us today. Senator Harder elaborated in great detail about the content of the message, and I want to refer in particular to the consequences for permanent residents who are convicted of summary offences under C-45. And of course, I'm disappointed that the government saw fit to reject this amendment, and this in spite of the reasoned approach that we put forward. We pointed out the distorted, disproportionate, unintended outcome of certain sections of C-45 on permanent residents, and not to repeat myself, but in essence, a double penalty is imposed on permanent residents who are found to be in contravention of C-45. And this double penalty is imposed even when there is conditional discharge or someone serves no time at all. We argued in committee and in the chamber, I believe, that this was not simply unfair, but also against the principle of the bill, which is decriminalization. And instead, as a knock-on effect, there is an over-the-top impact on just one class of residents, and that is permanent residents, whilst others follow a different path to rehabilitation. So different strokes for different folks, in other words. We did not ask for special treatment, but for equal treatment for those who are convicted. And by focusing the amendment on those whose penalty is less than 6 months, we would not be covering or dealing with those individuals who have caused bodily harm and therefore would be serious criminals. Our amendment was reasonable, it was constructive, and it was incremental. However, as we all know, the government has rejected this amendment, but what senators may not know that in the last few weeks, I and a few other senators have, as we have crafted different versions of this amendment, we have also had a number of conversations and exchanges with the minister and his office. And during these conversations, we have been able to convince the minister that action is required. In fact, it is required now, and are exploring different options for going forward. I will therefore not be insisting on this amendment, because I, for one, am willing to take the government at their word and the minister at his word, that they are in fact seized with this issue and the urgency to resolve it. We have been assured and reassured that they are actively looking at solutions in the short and the long term. I will not repeat what Senator Eggleton cited in the letter from Minister Hussain, only to say that a commitment has been made to working with us. And the letter says, for instance, that I am committed, the minister says to us, I am committed to carefully considering and addressing the immigration consequences of Bill C-45 and C-46. My department is examining the tools within my authority to mitigate immigration consequences, and so on and so forth. So whilst I am willing to take the minister and the government at their word, I parse the sentences, and I am cautious about the qualifying nature of the verbs that are involved. The minister uses words like explore, consider, and examine. Those are not exactly action words. So here's what I'm going to do. I intend to hold the minister to account for his promises in this letter and for his actions. We will be meeting with the minister in September to discuss how far his proposals, his solutions have come, and these will range from directives in the short term to proposed legislation in the long term. I also take comfort from a sentence in the letter that says that the department will be proactively informing the public, including permanent residents, to make them aware of the possible immigration consequences of engaging in prohibited cannabis-related criminal activities, as well as impaired driving, which takes us into C-46. So I believe that this chamber and the Social Affairs Committee did an excellent job in identifying an issue that the government had clearly overlooked and now are seized with. We have fulfilled our role of careful scrutiny of the bill and identified a major issue and a path forward. We have found, I believe, an appropriate and mutually respectful way of working with the other place. And in doing so, we have demonstrated our value to the people of Canada that we are indeed the House of Sober Second Thought. To that end, I say good work, honourable colleagues, and a job well done. Thank you.
Senator Omivar, would you take a question?
Absolutely.
Senator Radachuk.
Omivar, I understand that you're doing your best efforts to put something into an amendment. The minister's letter does not bind future administrations. So it's really at the goodwill of your relationship with the minister. Is that really the way we want to go on amendments? We've been through this before, and the best route would have been a change. So perhaps, are you saying to me that you're going to, I don't know who we was going to meet with the minister, but I would hope you would let us know. And would you consider in another session to put in an amendment to the bill?
Omivar.
I will absolutely inform the Chamber on the progress of these commitments. Legislation has been promised. It is within the context of IRPA, so there will be legislation coming. I don't know whether it will originate here or in the other place, and that is part of the agreement and the discussions that we will have.
Senator Faure.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll be brief today, and honestly, colleagues, I didn't think I would rise to speak on the message received from the other place on Bill C-45. I was hoping that the government would see the merit of our amendments, which we put forth with diligence and after careful thought throughout our study of C-45 since last November. And I'd like to highlight the excellent work of our colleague Senator Dean on this very complex file, but I can't hide my disappointment in the face of the motion we are studying today. I want to restate that I'm in favor of the legalization of cannabis in the best possible legislative environment. This bill will give people a choice. They'll be able to choose between purchasing and using cannabis from the black market, where nobody knows what's inside the product, and of purchasing and using cannabis which is controlled and which comes with a guarantee of ingredients and levels of THC. This was an election promise, and I know we have to respect the wishes of the elected government, but I cannot not respond to the message we received from the other.
The work that our colleagues here did in good faith to improve this bill in light of the exhaustive study we undertook and the relevant testimonies we heard. I feel uneasy, however, that this work seems completely under-evaluated by the government. Mon point de vue ici n'est pas au plan.
Now, I'm speaking not with regard to the Constitution or the legislation, because others have more expertise than I have. But I'd like to speak to two principles which I care deeply about and which are based on respect and partnership. First, respect of jurisdictions. I firmly believe in the principle of subsidiarity at every level. The governments of Quebec, of Manitoba, and of Nunavut have the legitimacy to ban home cultivation of cannabis. The appearance of the Intergovernmental Affairs Minister from Quebec, Mr. Jean-Marc Fournier, before the Legal Committee was very clear in that regard. The rejection of Amendment number 3 is difficult to explain because it would have reinforced their jurisdiction. The courts are as congested as the Turcotte interchange in Montreal during rush hour. The government knows very well that legal challenges will come almost as soon as the bill is passed, and the lack of openness of the government will only worsen an already bad situation. I find it unacceptable that we do not respect a legislator as legitimate as the provincial one, a level of government with which the Canadian government must build a strong climate of partnership if it wishes to reach the very complex objectives involved in the legalization of cannabis, with all the risks that implies. Further, provinces and territories will also have to create an environment which is conducive to a solid and efficient partnership with municipalities who will have to deal with the reality of this new legislation every day. The study undertaken by Quebec with Bill 157 was not without merit. Canada is a federation, and it's not a unitary state which dictates to its provincial partners whatever it wants without the possibility of compromise. Politics is the art of compromise, but today I don't see the government wanting to compromise at all. For instance, I don't understand how the owners of apartment buildings in Quebec will be allowed to prohibit certain activities related to the use of cannabis, but that the government of Quebec will not have that right. So there's a lack of consistency, and there's something truly not right about that. Lastly, I don't understand the public policy objective of creating a legal commercial market for the sale of cannabis. If home cultivation is allowed, does the government believe that commercial sales will be profitable if sharing of cannabis between individuals grows in popularity? In my humble opinion, I'm just wondering whether we are already undermining a market even before it is created. Second, I wonder whether the government really wants to, whether it really wants to impose limits on how cannabis is promoted. The amendment presented by the Senate would restrict these activities, and it was a cautious and reasonable amendment. We're all aware of the dangers of cannabis use, and one of the main objectives of the bill would be to not make cannabis use normal, especially amongst young people. Bill C-45 has to be stronger in that regard, and I don't think the bill is as strong as it should be when it comes to branding. So let's not hold back. Alcohol is being aggressively promoted in Quebec, and that should serve as a cautionary tale. It is inconceivable that we should be able to promote cannabis as we do alcohol.
Clear lack of optimism on the part of the government. I can't hide my disappointment. Nous avons collectivement une responsabilité constitutionnelle.
We all have a constitutional responsibility to give a sober second thought and a nonpartisan one on this bill. My responsibility is also to protect and defend the interests of Quebec and its regions, and that's what I'm trying to do today. If we choose to amend a bill, it's not only for the fun of doing so and to trigger more meetings within the PMO. The amendments put forth by the Senate will help to consolidate in a consistent way provincial legislation, Bill 157 in the case of Quebec, and federal legislation. But unfortunately, the government does not seem to see it that way. So, dear colleagues, I am going to reject the message from the House on C-45. I maintain that our changes are indispensable. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Honorable Senators, I would like to pay tribute to the commitments made to First Nations by the government to help adopt Bill C-45. I support these commitments because they allow us to place First Nations in a proper context. I would like to thank the provinces and territories for their serious arguments. They have chosen a cautious approach by prohibiting home cultivation. And this cautious approach is justified because Canada is the first OECD country which is going ahead with the legalization of cannabis. The arguments presented by the federal government to justify rejecting our amendment, which would have allowed the provinces to prohibit home cultivation, those arguments were not well thought out and don't meet a public policy objective. We still don't know exactly why the government rejected that amendment. It is not enough to list measures which provinces and municipalities could take to contain home cultivation. And if people can cultivate at home, it doesn't mean that black market cultivation will not continue. The government of Quebec has conducted an exhaustive study, and I recognize that the federal government has opposed Quebec's arguments on home cultivation. Public health experts of Quebec have presented many arguments. Three stood out for me. Home cultivation should not be allowed outside of the legal framework, especially cultivation by young people. A cautious and progressive approach should be adopted. Quebec would perhaps look at home cultivation at least 3 years down the road. The legal system is already congested. There will be legal challenges up to the Supreme Court when people will challenge Quebec's position banning home cultivation, which go against Bill C-45. We know that the government of Quebec and the government of Canada will eventually have to fight their battles in the courts, which will cost taxpayers money. Senator Tony Dean has done outstanding work and laid out all of the aspects of the issues and has answered all of Senators' questions. Many people who originally were against the bill, including senators from the Independent Senators Group and other senators who preferred decriminalization rather than legalization. Well, these people changed their minds following the clear answers given by Senator Dean and his team. Even though there is merit to the bill, I would have hoped that the debate would have taken place with the full respect of all participants. I think the federal government is not showing enough respect to the Senate, and I understand that the Senate should not ultimately stand up to a duly elected House of Commons. It should only do so in extenuating consequences. Ultimately, the government is responsible for its choices, and it will be up to Canadians to judge the government for those choices. Any democratic state which operates based on the rule of law holds its government to account. However, we should respect provincial jurisdiction in all legislation. And we want to avoid the, or rather, I supported the amendment proposed by Senator Carignan. I believe that provincial jurisdiction should be taken into account in the consideration of every bill and any repercussions which could occur in the courts. We must never forget, however, that the will of the House of Commons was highlighted in the message we received yesterday. Yet the provinces presented good arguments as well, so I hope that the situation will change. I will vote in favor of the message of the House of Commons. I will do so by thinking of all the people who in the provinces and the territories have worked very hard, including public safety services, police forces, healthcare services, social services, and all public services, as well as those businesses who from now on are going to be certified legally to make sure that Canadians who will buy cannabis will do so legally, and that this cannabis is controlled and of good quality. So this is one of the reasons why I am supporting the government's message. It is also to support those companies. Now, there's the matter of potential prosecutions under the bill, but I think that the bill on the whole is cautious. It will counter the black market, it will protect young people, and I think those are the main arguments which should go towards supporting the government's message. The Senate should defer to the elected government, who ultimately will be responsible to Canadians. Senator Dupuis on the debate. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Dear colleagues, I would like to speak to the message we received from the House of Commons. I believe that we are normalizing cannabis. We are in the process encouraging the production of a dangerous substance. Colleagues, we have all worked very hard, and we are now seized with the complexity of the legalization of cannabis. We have also shared the results of our work with Canadians who were able to follow our work in committee and who were able to listen to the questions we put to the many experts we heard from. I am going to support the legalization of cannabis, which will at least help to partly clean up the current market, which will improve the quality of legal cannabis products, and we will be creating a legal market. I don't believe that this bill is a silver bullet. However, even if the House of Commons rejected the amendment we proposed to clarify the issue of provincial and territorial jurisdiction, that is their right to prohibit home cultivation, as the governments of Quebec, Manitoba, and Nunavut have already announced. I believe that rejecting the amendment will not affect provincial jurisdiction, and in any case, the matter will end up before the courts, who will shed light on the matter. I believe that the Senate should review the act to demand accountability from the federal government. And when it comes to the implementation of this bill, I would like to invite all senators to turn their minds to a little-known provision in the rules. If there is disagreement between the House and the Senate, there are two procedures which we can turn to. First, there is the exchange of messages, like the one we are debating today, which can go on and on and on. Second, we could have a conference between the two chambers, which is contained at Section 16 of the Senate Standing Orders, and in Chapter 16 in the House Rules and Procedures. The dynamic of the Senate has changed greatly with the appointment of independent senators. And so the traditional processes, which was based on two political parties, is no more. I believe that the government must take note of this change and to seriously analyze the work which the Senate has carried out in its study of Bill C-45. So the federal government should take into account the new dynamic in the Senate with regard to the adoption of this bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Honorable colleagues, I had not planned to rise today to speak on debate, but I was compelled to do so given the importance of this debate, and I wanted to share my thoughts, and I intend to be very brief on it. I listened earlier to my good friend and colleague, Senator Eggleton, talk about the facts in this debate. And of course, the facts as I see them seem to be a little bit different than the facts that he sees. Clearly, the government has made it their overarching goal here to try to reduce the amount of cannabis use amongst young people. They constantly, throughout this whole debate, and as a catalyst for what they're doing, use the argument that marijuana use amongst young Canadians is amongst the highest in the world. The facts are, colleagues, that over the last 3 years, ever since they won an election, and no one takes away the fact that they had a clear mandate in their platform to put forward cannabis legislation, this government made no attempts whatsoever to get solid data baseline research information. There wasn't a single government agency that commissioned a single poll, a single study, a single analysis in order to back up a number of their arguments. And one would think that a government on a piece of legislation as important as this would not rely on tertiary information coming from other agencies around the world, but they would have been focused on gathering their own information. And the facts are, to this day as we speak, the only commission study that they're doing is by Health Canada, which is only underway as we speak to analyze the wastewater treatment facilities in this country in order to see the flow of marijuana. Their overarching goal, they say, is to reduce cannabis use amongst young people. I don't see the evidence in the various work that the Senate has done. What I've seen is an attempt on the part of a government, legitimately, as to transform an illegal activity into a legal activity. And I've seen a government essentially taking steps in order to get a piece of the action. I've seen, colleagues, a situation very similar to the era going back to Prohibition. What ended up happening is very simple. Government decided they wanted back then a piece of the action. So they took Prohibition and they went to alcohol being illegal to alcohol being legal. And governments cashed in big time. And the argument at the time was to, of course, take the illegal entities out of the game. And of course, we all know what ended up happening. What ended up happening, bootleggers became legal, multinational corporations made a lot of money, and we spent decades dealing with the problem of alcoholism. And we've spent billions as a society in order to educate people and try to reel back what inevitably was catastrophic as a social policy. And that is essentially what's going to happen here. You're going to have the illegal entities who are right now selling marijuana illegally becoming large corporations and making a lot of money. And you're going to have a lot of young people who are going to be using it because now we're normalizing it by this piece of legislation. And a small percentage of those, and I granted it's a small percentage, it could be 8, 10, 15, 16, depending on the study you look at, that will use marijuana as a gateway drug. And then will spend many, many years of their life in rehabilitation. And then government will spend tons of money, of course, on healthcare to rehabilitate these people and other social programs and all the other impacts that come with it. Again, why I look at the facts from a different perspective. I'm not so convinced that this government is preoccupied with education, because at the end of the day, they've been now in power for close to 3 years. And we've seen now 3 successive budgets, and limited to no resources have been put in education. And it has nothing to do with platforms, because I have children on various platforms, and I can assure you, as of we speak, there hasn't been a major concerted effort on the part of this government or previous governments to educate people the way we've done with smoking, the way we've done with alcohol. Because unfortunately, governments wait for a problem to become a crisis before they act. But the consequences of acting too late with this one is just too high a price. Again, I question the government's intention from not being what their overarching goal is to take marijuana use out of the hands of young people. Look at the very intelligent amendment that this chamber put forward on brand stretching, which was refused by the other side. Again, which is a small step in limiting and reducing the promotion of cannabis use amongst young people. An amendment that was refused in this place to raise the age limit from 18 to 19 or 21 was refused again by this institution. And again, it's a shame, because we're throwing down the tube reports from the Canadian Medical Association, the Canadian Nurses Association, the Canadian Psychologists Association, secondary schooling, post-secondary schooling education, and people that are dealing with young people on a daily basis. And I didn't hear one who came before our committee and said this was going to be anything less than catastrophic. I heard testimony after testimony, and Senator Dean made his point that, of course, I'm exaggerating when I'm saying doctors are claiming that marijuana use amongst young people from 0 to 24 has a negative effect on their brain development. And actually, he claims that as they get older, the level of damage to their cerebral mind becomes less and less. I don't care if it's 2%. I don't care if it's 3% for a 23-year-old that uses marijuana. At the end of the day, there's an impact that it will have on that misguided individual who's using it that we as a society will pay for down the line. And that's something, again, I cannot just neglect and toss aside. As my colleague Senator Andrzejczyk pointed out, our government is a signatory of 3 major international conventions. The Minister herself of Foreign Affairs came before the committee and said, we are in breach. What have you done in order to mitigate those breaches? Absolutely nothing. We're just talking with our friends and allies. But that's the least of it all. The impact, the greatest impact of all, again, will be with our trading partner, our largest trading partner, where we've heard time and time again that their federal laws are clear when it comes to marijuana use. What kind of an impact is it going to have on the border exchange, on our trade exchange, on our people crossing at various checkpoints between the United States and Canada? Colleagues, at the end of the day, when it's all said and done, the Senate has a fundamental responsibility. And the argument I've been hearing also today that it's not our role to stand in the way of the elected legitimate House. And no, it's not, except for very particular moments and times in history. And this chamber has at certain times stood against and defeated government legislation. Granted, it's been a handful of times, but when this chamber found certain pieces of legislation egregious and dangerous for the future of this country, we have an obligation to be heard. Colleagues, at the end of the day, the other place is the place of politics. It's the place of public mandates. But this is the place where it's not about only popularity, it's about doing the right thing. And if we as an institution, and to quote Senator Joyal, who has spoken many times, have the right as a chamber to vote for pieces of legislation, we also have the right as a chamber to vote against pieces of legislation when we think it's in the best interest of the regions and the people we represent. So I think this is one of those times where we need to stand up and speak on behalf of our conscience, the people we represent. Doesn't matter if it's the Native leaders in this group. There's senators in this place that are strong voices for the Aboriginal communities. Now's the time to be counted. And again, the fact, Senator Eggleton, is I don't have faith in a government that comes here with a letter on 5 minutes to midnight before a vote and says, don't worry, there are concerns you have, we'll address them. I think Aboriginal and Native groups have seen sometimes what veiled promises are from governments. Now's their opportunity to stand up and send a message. Now's our opportunity also as legislators, not only to vote on this bill, colleagues, as legislators, but to vote on this bill as parents, as grandparents, because at the end of the day, I don't believe there's a single person in this place that would reach out to their child and normalize the use of marijuana and say it's a good thing, or their grandchild. I think we all recognize the social and economic impact this is going to have. I hope at the end of the day, we will go with our conscience and not with political expediency. That's why I cannot support this. Thank you.
Your question, Senator Martin?
No, Your Honor, I'd like to contribute to the debate.
Senator Munson is next. I'm going to go to you, Senator Martin. Senator Munson?
Honourable Senators, I thought I'd add a little lighthearted levity to the end of our debate, but with a message that I wrote. The senators came to debate, and debate they did. What captured their curiosity was cannabis, and should it be legalized instead of decriminalized? But what they realized, that this was no ordinary issue, and sides were drawn. Every day brought a new dawn of ideas, some were for and some were against, and every senator put up a great defense. Dealing with the black market as opposed to an open market, dealing with public health and education, taking a look at the habits of a new generation. Questions were asked, statements were made, but in the Senate of Canada, no one was afraid afraid to take a stand because each senator knew they had a hand in dealing with a bill which would change the landscape of the land. At the end of the day, they amended the bill. Some were accepted, some were rejected. But in the words of a song that some may understand, it is time to pass the bill, pass the duchy to the left-hand side. And senators, if you don't understand the last line, I will explain outside. Thank you very much.
Senator Martin.
Yes, honourable senators, I too rise just to add a few more comments to this very important debate before our vote on the message from the House. And I was just very disappointed at the message regarding the number of amendments that were rejected. I know the talking points say of 45 amendments, this many were accepted, but really the vast majority of the amendments that the government accepted were their own technical amendments that were introduced by Senator Dean at committee. And if the third reading debate is any indication of the kind of sloppiness that we will continue to see, is that the amendment, the final technical amendment that Senator Mitchell moved in the chamber, had an error. And had Senator Seidman not pointed out this error, a missing S in a word, because it is all about the exactness of our language, the punctuation mark, and an S that, had we not included that and corrected it, would have potentially excluded our chamber from being part of the review and reporting process. So this is what happened at third reading. And we now see that all this work that our chamber has done, all the incredible work that the sponsor, the critics, the committee chairs and vice chairs, and every single member, and every single one of us that participated in the 7-month-long process, that it was just almost entirely rejected by the government. So it's deeply disappointing to me to rise today to, I guess, share my frustration at this point, wondering whether or not any of that will make a difference. But as the vote looms before us, I thought of one missing voice from, a smaller voice from this debate. So on behalf of the municipalities and the concerns that were raised by them, just as Senator Carignan spoke about the importance of the provincial jurisdiction and why we supported the amendment, why I supported that amendment, I want to just remind senators of the voices around the table, not as many as we had hoped, but from municipalities and one jurisdiction in my province, and a councillor who continues to message me saying, is there anything else we can do? So today I need to say these words to remind senators of the concerns raised by our municipal councillors and mayors. And in the city of Richmond, BC, Councillor Al was one of the witnesses that were called by the Social Affairs Committee. And these are his words. He broke down the municipality's concerns into 5 major issues. The first one is home cultivation. We are concerned that the bill, as is, will allow people to grow marijuana at home. In our assessment of the situation, we think this is not enforceable, and it will defeat the original stated purpose of Bill C-45, which is to protect young people from having access to marijuana. The second concern is about the age of possession. We noticed in all provinces, not one of them would suggest that we should allow minors under the age of 18 to have possession, which has been addressed, I realize, in the rejection of one of the amendments. The third concern is that we have is the readiness of law enforcement institutions to implement the law or the regulations. We have heard a lot from other cities and across the country that we are not ready. We don't have the resources, the training, the tools, or the manpower to carry out enforcement once this legislation is passed and enforce it fall or this summer. The 2 other comments I would like to make is that we are opposed to using farmland for the production of marijuana. Finally, regarding costs, we have heard from different sources that it will be a huge cost for municipal governments to implement or regulate the legislation. And the concerns raised by Councillor Au are similar to concerns raised by municipalities across this country. During the study, Matt Zablosky from the City of Calgary said, quote, As the realm of personal production expands and individuals are able to grow their own cannabis, city staff have serious concerns over potential health implications, and resources are required to regulate non-commercial growing. And Bill Karsten, a councillor from Halifax, had this to say, quote, "Senators, we need new financial tools to get this done. We appreciate very much, in fact, that the federal government has committed $81 million to support municipalities in training police for the new regime. But that $81 million, however, from our vantage point, is only a drop in the bucket. Colleagues, the legislation we are discussing will offload the responsibility of federal legislation to the provinces and then to the municipalities, but has neglected to listen to the advice of the same people who will be responsible for enforcing the bill. Municipalities are concerned, we know provinces are concerned, and we should all be concerned. The government claims this bill will protect our youth from having greater access to cannabis, but we know it will not protect youth. With the legal age being set in certain provinces at 18, high school students will especially be at risk for greater access. Senator Seidman's amendment prohibiting brand stretching, had it been accepted, would have provided some protection to minors from unnecessarily being exposed to marketing by marijuana companies. I saw one such example even before legalization, and the logo was very attractive. The bags were very multi-purposeful. So we can imagine the kind of exposure that our minors, that our children across our country will be exposed to. Now, we know that there's problems with workplace safety, and recently there was an announcement, the Canadian military, about what adjustments they may make, but I sat next to commanding officers at a regimental dinner who said, you know, we've had a zero tolerance policy, and I'm sure that will continue. So when I saw the recent report, it concerned me what could happen, you know, in workplaces, but also for the Canadian military, and what they are operating at the best of times, and how important it will be to really monitor carefully. But in a place where it has been a zero tolerance culture, I think it's going to be quite an adjustment. So despite the government's assurances, I know I've raised this before, but Senator Massicott asked the question to Senator Harder about where is this evidence that by legalizing marijuana, having a legal market, will reduce the cannabis, or reduce the contraband or illegal black market. We know the infrastructure is there, and I do believe that that will be used to ensure that the black market is alive and growing. Otherwise, how can we explain that suddenly with our legalization, that certain companies have announced that they're going to be tripling, you know, making their companies 10 times larger by the end of this year? Where is all of this cannabis going to? So for Canada to become the second country in the entire world, a federal jurisdiction to legalize cannabis, I guess we're going to become these exporters to the world, and that is not something that I want to see nor support. And I have expressed before that we all agree that criminalization of marijuana has not worked, and we must address that, and that should be our urgent focus, rather than opening up the entire nation to a legalized marijuana market without having seen at least the details of the regulations, as well as assurances of preparation that is being done to ensure that Canadians and societies, municipalities are ready for what is about to happen. I foresee a lot of first 5-year, gaps in the overall system, and we should all be very, very concerned. And as this vote to this message from the House is before us, I just urge honourable senators once again to just carefully think about what we are voting on. I know that I will be voting against the message, which in essence reminded us that all the work we had done had been in vain, because most of it was rejected. Most of the amendments that the government accepted were their own technical amendments to errors that they had made in the drafting of the original bill. So I urge all honourable senators to really carefully vote in this final vote that is coming before us on the message to the House and reject that message. Thank you.
Senators ready for the question? It was moved by the Honourable Senator Harder, PC, seconded by the Honourable Senator Mitchell, that the Senate agree to the amendment the House of Commons made to Senate Amendment. May I dispense? All those in favour of the motion will please say yea. Yay! All those opposed, nay. Nay! In my opinion, the ayes have it. I see 2 senators rising. Do we have an agreement on a bell? 30 minutes. The vote will take place at 7:18. Call in the senators.